Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, it's been a couple weeks since I've been on here. So, about that, okay, the first thing I want to do, because there's a lot to talk about with what's been going on with cameras and lenses and photography and all that. It's been a couple weeks, too, since I have addressed comments on my channel. So let me bring up, speaking of comments, let me bring up comments here for all of you. And so I wanted to do that because I went to go ahead and answer a lot of them earlier today, and I realized that it had been a couple weeks since I've done that. So, and there were some good ones too. There's some good ones that I kind of wanted to throw out into the live discussion so I can get some of your input on it as we are here right now. So a lot of these comments were a couple videos ago that I'd published on my channel was my prediction that the Canon R1 will have a 36 megapixel sensor. And let's see, Mike Ransom, how you doing, bud? New A9 coming, looks by January, February, if not sooner. I kind of, you know what, we'll get into that. Because I kind of still have a little bit of a different opinion on whether we're even going to see an A9 or not. Yeah, and it dovetails into the R1 and all that too. But as I was saying, the Canon R1, I believe, will have a 36 megapixel sensor. And if you didn't see that video, I'll give you kind of the quick and dirty of it right now. The Canon 1 series and 5 series cameras have always been very different in that the 1 series are always going to be the more robust ones. They're going to be the ones that, you know, have all the weather sealing and such. They're going to be a lot faster. They're typically going to be much more fully featured than the 5 series cameras, but they're going to lack to the 5 series cameras in resolution. And so since the upcoming R5 Mark II is rumored to be a 61 or 2 or so megapixel sensor, it would stand to reason that if Canon is going to continue on their typical design criteria between the 1s and the 5s, that the R1 will be lesser resolution than that. So how did I get to 36? It's because 36 megapixels is 35 or 36, depending on aspect ratio, is the minimum amount of megapixels you need to create an 8K frame. And even though we're talking about the Canon R1, which is going to be a stills flagship and in the hands of stills photographers primarily, an ever-increasing important metric by which all of these flagships are compared against each other is video specs and video resolution. And so I think it needs to have a minimum amount to get 8K. That would be about 35, 36 megapixel. I don't think it's going to be more than that. It's going to be stacked. The R3 is already stacked, but Canon is going to, in true Canon fashion, differentiate their lines of camera. So their 1s and their 5s like they always have done. So that's kind of laying the groundwork as to why 36 megapixel. And there was a lot of really great comments on that video. So I'm going to read you one of them right now. This is from Andrew Cutchess. He says, and part of that video too, let me back up just a second. Part of that video too is that I think Canon needs to kind of throttle it being a very high megapixel sensor because of all of the old guy sports shooters that are somewhat resolution averse. And that's important to point out because of what he says in his comment here. So Andrew says, having shot as a professional photojournalist with the Canon 1DX Mark II and lenses, the camera workflow needs to be fast, racing to send off images to an editor within a short period of time. Why? Because the journalists are already waiting for the pictures by the end of the event. That's true. Camera must work in freezing snow, sports, a protest while it's pouring rain, thrown into the trunk of a car, and indoors where that cannot be flash as political candidates speak. It must have top-notch low light settings, fast autofocus, and fast processing speed. You don't even have time to swap lenses. You run in 2 camera bodies for different focal lengths. That's what sports photographers do too. This camera needs to convince professionals to swap from the 1DX Mark II or Mark III to the R1 and RF lenses. This isn't asking for upgrade. This is a camera that requires companies and professionals to buy 2 camera bodies and RF lenses. It has to deliver. So thank you, Andrew, for that comment. And this is the reason I decided to point this comment out, is because Andrew, respectfully, seems like the kind of OG resolution averse. I called it sports photographer, but it seems like he's more of a commercial, photojournalist, do kind of anything. It's the same family of customer for Canon, right? I think what he fails to mention and maybe realize is a very important point within the infrastructure that everything operates these days. And that is, we have 5G cell networks. We have Starlink, we have, all these things. And so, especially with Canons, and I've been both knee-deep into Canon and Sony systems at the same time, Canon files are lighter than Sony files by about half. So if you take a 50 megapixel Sony Alpha 1 and you take a 45 megapixel Canon R5 or an R5C, and you're shooting uncompressed RAW in both bodies, the Canon files end up being 1 megabyte per megapixel, whereas the Sonys end up being about 2 megabytes per megapixel of resolution. And so the Canon files are lighter than the Sony files by about half as much. And that does have some implications, and you can see that later in the grading process as it pertains to pulling out dynamic range from the files and such, but that's a different conversation for a different day. My point in broad strokes is that the infrastructure exists now to be delivering those photos to the journalists that are waiting for them before the event ends in real time, just as you would deliver in real time a 20 to 24 megapixel photo. The networks are that fast nowadays that is not going to be your bottleneck. They can deliver, because here's the other thing, folks that are doing this type of work, they're not shooting big files either. They're not shooting uncompressed RAWs. They aren't even shooting RAWs. They're typically shooting JPEGs and getting them straight to publish, And so my point on all this is this. I think Canon will have megapixels in the 30s, and I think it's going to, one, be because it is what you need to have an 8K frame. Two, it's going to be because it's going to wean these older, somewhat resolution averse photographers, photojournalists, sports photographers who are used to that type of an infrastructure where they have to move those files very quickly on the fly. It's going to wean them into higher resolution, because right now they don't want to believe that that's actually possible, but it totally is. Okay, from a technical standpoint of image capture, like the Alpha 1 does really well in low light, high ISO. The R5 does really well in low light, high ISO, and these cameras now, these high resolution cameras, the 45 megapixel, 50 megapixel cameras of the day are better at high ISO speeds than were cameras even just a few years ago that had half the resolution. So I know that the old habits die hard, but there's really no penalty these days, broadly speaking. There are still some things that you can find the lower resolution cameras do a little bit better than the higher resolution cameras, but broadly speaking, there is no penalty for shooting higher resolution, especially because the latest crop of high-resolution cameras also will have features to bend down into lower resolutions. So I still think the R1's going to be the 35, 36 megapixel that I said. I don't think there are technical limitations to keep that style of camera at 20 or 24 megapixels anymore. The only real limitation now is selling it to the core customer. And the core customer may be people like Andrew, who, total professional, he knows what he needs, but he doesn't either trust or realize that the infrastructure exists for a high-resolution body to no longer be a penalty like he was used to it being. So I wanted to point out that comment, though, because that was a really good one. And I'll kind of sprinkle them in here, too, the other ones, because there were a lot of them I didn't get to, or a lot of really good ones I didn't get to. Mike Ransom, I'm good, bud. I have been slowing down, so my real estate work is, you know, it's very seasonal, so it's been slowing down for the season, which will give me some more time to do publish more videos on you. I just published one yesterday about perspective distortion and how to use perspective distortion as a creative tool while shooting interiors. So I published that just yesterday, and so you know, it'll give me some time to you know, to do that. Can't the R3 do that? Can't the R3 do what part of that? I mean, okay, here's the thing, right? Like, so what Andrew was describing, all of those, if that's what you're asking, you know, can't the R3 do that? Do the, you know, the freezing mud and the this and the fast and that and the, yeah, it can. And part of that video that I'd made that he was replying to, that the Canon is going, the R1's going to be 36 megapixel. Part of that is actually pointing out that that's who I think the R3 was designed for to begin with. That was that crowd's first step into going into a mirrorless mount, because the R3 is a low megapixel, it's a 24 megapixel stacked, and it's clearly Canon's best camera. I had one for a couple months. I was using it primarily as my primary stills body for a couple months before Josh Satin and I did a trade back. He wanted his R3 back, and I got one of my R5Cs back. It is clearly Canon's best body. But the strange thing about the R3 is that even though it's Canon's best body, why is it 24 megapixel? Now, it could be because Canon's sensor technology, their full frame sensor technology, wasn't able to build a higher resolution stacked sensor and still meet all of the other criteria for speed and all that they wanted to have in the R3 to make it the approximate of the 1DX3. Or it could be that they're sensitive to customers like Andrew, and that they know that the OGs die hard as far as preferring the low resolution bodies. And so they kind of have to wean these guys into the high resolution a little bit at a time. But at the same time, it's like, okay, let's say that Andrew is their core customer and he is a bit of resolution averse for all the reasons that he stated, and they're fine points that he's made. How does that, though, dovetail with Canon's competition? Because there's an arms race going on, right, between Canon and Sony and Nikon, and I don't think anybody else than Canon and Sony and Nikon, because nobody else is really building full frames that are worth being in that conversation with them. But there's an arms race, and so the Canon R1's biggest problem, it doesn't even exist yet, or it probably does, but nobody knows about it other than a select few people. The Canon R1's biggest problem is the Sony Alpha 1, because the Sony Alpha 1 is such a monster. It still is, you know, it'll do 30 frames per second, I believe uncompressed RAW, 50 megapixel. That is more data than anything else out there. It does a 1/400th maximum flash sync speed. That is almost twice what like the Z9 and the R3 will do. It's just a beast, you know. And so that's the Canon R1's biggest problem is the Sony A1. And so yes, the Canon R3 can do all that. There might be a downscale option. You know, and a lot of the newer cameras, they're starting to do that. Like I think the A7R5 is doing that, and I think there is a Canon, maybe one of the crop bodies like the R7 might do that, but that's starting to be a thing, you know, the new Fuji medium format, I think it's doing that too. So when you start to see, you know, these cameras just in that particular approach be adopted industry-wide, yeah, because it makes a lot of sense. The A1 does through a firmware update, it didn't always do this, but through a firmware update, it now does medium and small uncompressed RAWs. And but I don't know how it's doing that. I don't know if it's binning or what. I always just shot max uncompressed RAWs. Sports camera, yeah, the R3, totally, yeah. R3 is the R3 is so much better than the R5 variant cameras, and I haven't tried the R6 II, but I know the R6 II is kind of you know, it's of the same generation as the R3. So let me, before I get into any more comments, let me talk about what I am shooting on right now. So I'm on the red Komodo-X. I have the 24-105 f4 L series lens on the Komodo-X. I've got a mist filter. I think it's a quarter stop. Might be a Tiffin. It's in a matte box. It's in a matte box and then going through a teleprompter. So lens is wide open at f4. The AEA KU5A ribbon hypercordioid active ribbon mic going into the Rodecaster Pro 2. I think I said that right. And then both, I have a light here and a light there. They are both the Amaran F22C. They're the matte, the RGB mats, and I just got them a couple weeks ago. Almost returned them because the control boxes are so darn noisy, and I might make a review on these and show that. So what I actually have done that you can't see off camera over there is I have put both of those control boxes, and I have like a sound blanket that I put over a rod and then put the control boxes under there so they can still breathe because they still have sound, or they still have airflow rather going through, but it keeps the noise from getting over to me. And so it's kind of a pain in the neck, you know, and they're really good products other than that. I mean, they're accurate, they're super light. I mean, these things are super, super light. So you can support them with any kind of stand. They're 2x2 flexible mats. They come with softbox. They come with a grid. They're really a neat product. If it just wasn't for the control box, it's got this fan that just goes, you know, at all times in it. So that's unfortunate. You know, it's a bit of a miss by Amaran there. If it was an Aputure product, and you kind of understand when you start feeling like the Amaran Pro, because I have an Aputure Nova and I have some other Aputure lights too. They're just better built, you know, the Aputure stuff is. And so I understand why Aputure is going to be marketing this as an Amaran and not an Aputure. Okay, more comments on the megapixel, on the Canon megapixel thing. I think there's an obsession with megapixels. If there are too many megapixels on a sensor, the images will look like crap. Same as if there aren't enough. I understand there are people that want a lot of megapixels for cropping because you lose image quality when cropping, but still, how many do you really need? I don't know where this is. Height is Merrick. I don't know why you're under the impression that too many megapixels on a sensor makes images look like crap. I mean, the modern implementation of high-resolution sensors just leads to detail. You know, it leads to detail, it leads to sharpness, it leads to increased color fidelity, it leads to a hedge against different types of lens aberrations like moire, you know, or I should say sensor aberrations like moire. You know, so you don't need like anti-aliasing filters on the front of your sensors to get rid of artifacts like that. So, and it's this, you know, it's this kind of line of thinking. And so, like, a lot of these comments that I got on that video are kind of like, no, you don't need any more. Well, you know, there aren't any disadvantages to shooting high resolution nowadays. Like all these things that we're talking about, the FTP networks being as fast as they are, the cell networks being as fast as they are, the low light capability of some of the higher resolution bodies right now, the being able to pull more detail even out of crap lenses, because that's another thing that high resolution sensors do is all of your even junk lenses look better now. they do that, you know. There really isn't a downside to shooting high resolution anymore, not in a commercial setting, and especially not if, like what you pointed out, Mike, you can, you know, delve down the, sorry, just hit my mic on you. You can get it to be a lower resolution. So, okay. Oh, another one. The last, this is, well, what then is his name? Last review with common sense. Give me a rugged and reliable camera any day that can take on any super harsh environment. That's the R3, by the way. I mean, he didn't say the R3, but that's what the R3 is. Environment. This crazy for a megapixel is stupid, and only fools think 36 megapixel is not enough. You'll never see Fuji striving to make a high megapixel sports and wildlife. Well, they make 100 megapixel medium format, so I don't know where you're on about there. Camera. They have more sense, and Sony or Nikon are chasing fairy tales, just like those idiots in petapixel. That wants a camera to make them tea and toast. Okay. Yeah. And this guy, you know, and I actually responded to him and I said, look, you know, high megapixel cameras are not, let me think about how to say this. There are those who need high megapixel. The first subset of photographer that comes to mind is wildlife photographers. You can only get so close to a bird in flight or some type of dangerous animal that you don't want to touch, right? You need the croppability for that. The second type of photographer that needs the megapixel are commercial photographers. Commercial photographers, product photographers. You know, these images are marketed in so many different types of ways. There are, like, even shooting interiors like I do. Like if I do high-end interior work for builders and designers and things like that, I'm shooting sometimes with room for copy in mind, you know, because my image is only going to be, well, the focus of my image is only going to be a very small part of the frame, and there's going to be other types of marketing that are happening within the frame, and I need a frame for that, you know. And like another one is, and I think I've shown this before on my channel, even shooting real estate, taking the front elevation of a home, okay, to decrease the perspective distortion and make it not look like a fun house that you're standing right in front of. One of the techniques you can do, unless you want to haul a tilt shift lens around with you everywhere, is you can back up, zoom in. Now, when you do that, you're going to have a lot of street because you're a lot closer to the street than you are the top of the house. And so in post, you're going to faux yourself some elevation by cropping up the corners. That actually crops in an image quite a bit. Now, if you only have 20 megapixel to play with to begin with, you know, what are you going to be left with? Is it really going to be a sharp image anymore? So, you know, that there aren't people out there that need high megapixel cameras, I think that's kind of a foolish thing to say. But what burns me about the whole thing is that I don't have any problem with the petapixel guys, but they are part of the problem in this sense, and that is the influencers, the manufacturers are selling high megapixel cameras as if they're something that everybody needs, and everybody doesn't need that. In fact, I think most people don't need that. And the people who do need that, they can tell you exactly why. Like I just did with the, you know, cropping up to faux some elevation and get rid of perspective distort. Like they can tell you exactly why they need it. They can tell you exactly why they can't get, but, you know, 800 feet away from that dangerous whatever over there animal, right? Drunken cougar or something. They can tell you why they need it. And they're not the average. And so there is part of this that's just an arms race for more pixels. But to arbitrarily say, oh, nobody needs it, no, that's just not true. You know, I mean, if that were true, then medium format wouldn't even be a thing, right? So, I mean, the whole point of medium format is that you can get very high resolution while still getting a lot of light to each, light sensor in the sensor itself, every receptor in the sensor itself. And so your signal to noise ratio stays real high too. So, okay, let's go on from that video, shall we? Let's see. It's Mike. Gerald Undone reviewed a $30,000 art. I know, I saw that. Wasn't that cool? So I thought that was a really neat review. And so what Mike's talking about is Gerald Undone had a RE Supreme Prime Master Cinema. Stop, spam. Master Cinema. They're made for them by Zeiss. So it's a very high-end Zeiss lens with RE branding on it. And $30,000 and a couple interesting things that I took away from that was when Gerald was reviewing it, he says it's big, right? It's huge. It's like, and it's in this big chody. So it was 35 millimeter lens that he had. And he said, the reason why it's so big is because then they have to put less aggressive curvature in all of the different lens elements inside it. So when you have lesser aggressive, grinding of the glass into these convex and concave type of shapes inside it, it will end up making a cleaner lens. And so the size of the thing is actually a byproduct of that type of design consideration, right? Whereas like with a lot of the stills lenses, and you have little tiny lenses, well, in order to get them to correct for the barrel distortion and stuff like that, you have to have really, really aggressive types of curvature in those lens groups and things. And so it makes the designs kind of more complicated and, a little bit worse performing and such. And so that's kind of my main takeaway with him reviewing that RE lens at $30,000. I think the other one was, it's not in a lot of metrics that he was testing significantly better than the good stills lenses are now. And he was comparing it against the 35 G Master, Sony G Master. And so, when he was taking a look at sharpness and chromatic aberration and, and barrel distortion, and all these other things that you look at with a lens, it was better, but it was slightly better. So when you figure, a $30,000 lens versus what's the G Master, like $1,500 or whatever it is, a couple grand maybe. What does that buy you? Well, it buys you repeatability. It buys you service life. Certainly because they're made to an extraordinarily high standard, right? But what I got out of that though is like, lens design and modern manufacturing techniques and such with lenses, kind of we've gotten to the point now where it's like you don't buy a $30,000 Cine lens because it looks appreciably better than a $1,500 lens. You buy it for those other reasons. You buy it because it has a look, right? So the other thing this RE lens did was it had replaceable filters that you could put on the back element that kind of dirty it up in different ways. And so it's different looks. And it was really neat. He was going through like, well, this one does donuts in the foreground and soap bubbles in the back or whatever it was, right? And it would change both the foreground and the background out of focus areas. That was a really neat review. That's one of my favorite ones that Gerald's done actually. So, but yeah, focus breathing, totally. Yeah, that's absolutely. And I bet too, Mike, that's a byproduct of like what we were saying about just being the big elements that are a little bit less aggressively curved and such in it. It probably has a lot to do with controlling that focus breathing. Whereas stills lenses will. I don't want to pick on the GMs. I know the GMs really breathe a lot, but like I've got this one actually is pretty good. So the Canon 24 to 105 f4. I like this lens a lot for video because it barely breathes at all. But like the Canon, I don't have it right over here. The Fast 50, the 51.2, it breathes like a mother. it looks like it goes from a 40 millimeter lens to a 60 millimeter lens when you rack focus on the thing. And the big, I call it the Chodester, the 28 to 70 f2L RF lens. That one too. I mean, it's obnoxious the way that it breathes. And you know, do Canon cameras have focus breathing compensation? I don't know if many of them do. I don't know if the R5C does. But you know, nowadays I'm shooting most of my video. I'm shooting on the Red, and the Red doesn't have any of that stuff. You know, it doesn't have the focus breathing compensation. It doesn't have the distortion correction and stuff. And that was one of the things I was going to talk about too here. Image circle. What with the Cine lens? Well, I thought it was cool. So yeah, so the image circle. Maybe what you're referring to is. Ari had like a projector that they shot the light through that then projects the different test patterns onto the wall instead of it coming the other way. Instead of taking a picture of the test patterns, that it then projects onto the sensor, and then you read the image from there. But that was pretty interesting because you could see the entire image circle and everything on it. And so let me get into the lens that was just like I think yesterday announced and released, not shipping yet, I don't think. The Canon 10 to 20 f4 RF L lens. And it replaces the 11 to 24, I think it was, EF lens, which is huge. I mean, it's just an enormous lens. I've never had one. I held one once and said, I don't know. You know, it's huge. So Canon just announced and released this 10 to 20 f4 RF lens. And my first, so I had two initial thoughts on this thing. Never having seen one or whatever. I'm not on that list, right? My two initial thoughts on this lens is that is going to be an extraordinary lens for crop sensor. Yes, Mike, image stabilized. That's right, it is. That's going to be a great lens for crop sensor cameras for shooting real estate. I like to be, for real estate video especially, I like to be around the 18 millimeter perspective full frame. Right, so crop sensor camera with a 10 on it, you're going to be about 15 or so. Let's say that you have some image stabilization or digital image stabilization as well on that, which I know like the C70 does. So it's going to crop in a little bit further from that. So you're going to end up like probably right around that 18 millimeter perspective with that lens all the way out. And that's great because Canon really didn't have a lens that did that. So the widest they go currently before this is the 14 millimeter in the 14 to 35. Now, that was my first thought, is it's going to be great for crop sensor cameras for shooting real estate and interiors. It's way too wide for a full frame. You know, I know that there are people who would do that, right? But I'm just not one of them. But my follow-up thought, my very next thought was, but I've tried the 14 to 35. I've tried the 14 to 35. I own the 15 to 35. I did not keep the 14 to 35 because when you are not shooting on a first-party camera, when you're not shooting on a Canon camera with the 14 to 35, if you put it on a Red camera, which is what I had it on at the time, where it does not have any of those lens profile corrections on board, the 14 to 35 Canon RF lens is not a well-corrected lens. I mean, it's like Bow City, like everywhere, right? And so it really shows you how much you're getting out of those in-camera correction profiles in the Canon cameras. The 15 to 35 is a much better corrected lens. The 15 to 35 f2.8, it just is. You know, you go all the way out to 15 millimeter, you can do apples to apples and do 15 millimeter on the 14, and it's still way worse than the 15 is all the way out and wide open and everything else. The 15 to 35 is just a better lens. So So that was my second thought is, okay, first thought, it's going to be great for crop sensor real estate. Second thought is, what if I want to run it on the Komodo? Is it going to be well corrected? I mean, the only things that I've seen so far about this new Canon lens are coming from the people who get the lens early, and I haven't seen anybody put it on a Komodo. I mean, I get it. That's not going to be a huge design consideration to Canon, is how the lens is going to run on a red Komodo. You know, they're gonna design it maybe well corrected, maybe not, to be run on their cameras that have those correction profiles on board. And I mean, what's kind of interesting about this, as it kind of relates to vintage lenses or older EF lenses, is a lot of those lenses came from a time where you did not have that option. You didn't have the option to correct all the, you know, the rectilinear distortions and such in camera or in post. It's just a, you know, a fishbowl-y looking lens is a fishbowl-y looking lens. That's what you got. So in some regard, I think that the newer designs are all going to be like smaller, lighter, all that kind of stuff. They probably aren't going to be as well corrected either, because they're going to run into physics somewhere with the thing, and they're going to rely on that software correction within the camera body itself, or within your NLE or Lightroom profile or something like that, to be able to straighten out all those edges and stuff. So, you know, and like, I'll give you a for instance, like, I don't know when the CNEs, the Cinema Primes, first came about, but I had a set of Cinema Primes for a few years, ended up selling them. But one of the lenses that I used pretty often was the 14 millimeter Canon Cinema Prime EF mount. And it was an extraordinarily well corrected lens. And, you know, some would say like, oh, well, that's because it's a cinema lens. Well, is it? I mean, is it because it's a cinema lens, or is it because it's from, you know, they're pretty old, or is it because it's from a day where you didn't have all the other stuff correcting it afterwards? So, you know, could be a little bit of both. But those are my two first thoughts on that. And you're right, Mike. It is stabilized, and that's one of the things that I point to when I'm talking about the Sony versus Canon thing. And I was a Sony shooter for many years, and now I've migrated over to Canon, and I'm shooting all my stills I'm shooting on Canon, and mostly I'm shooting motion on the red Komodo-X. And one of the reasons that I went over, there were two reasons I really went over to Canon from Sony. It's not because I dislike Sony products. I think they're fantastic. It's because I like shooting on red, and the red and the Canon share a lens mount and the RF lens mount. And so that's just logistically, it's, you know, commonality of lens mount. You need a whole lot less gear with you and such. So I enjoyed that. And the other thing is, I like that so many of the RF lenses are image stabilized. And so to your point that the new 10 to 20 is image stabilized, that's awesome. You know, and again, that's maybe because of my use case. You know, I shoot on the red, and it doesn't have any kind of image stabilization on board. I shoot on the R5C, same kind of thing. You know, it's got a pin sensor, but, you know, and I understand that the Canon lenses, the Canon RF-L lenses, are typically a bit bigger, heavier, and more expensive than other competing lenses from the other major manufacturers. But I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, is so many of them are stabilized within the lens, and it works really well too. So, you know, so those are the two reasons: commonality of the lens mounts, and I just like the lenses better than the Sony lenses. Beyond that, this is something that Josh Satin and I have been talking about recently. Beyond more of the Canon RF lenses being image stabilized within the lens, they also share more of a common family look than what my experience with any of the Sony lenses are. The Sony lenses all look very different one from the next. The 16 to 35 G Master is a great lens, but It doesn't look anything like the 24GM. Doesn't look anything like the 2470. Doesn't look, you know, and the 24GM doesn't look like the 50GM. And they all kind of look different. My favorite Sony lens is the 85G Master, and it's one of the oldest lenses, and it's a lens that everybody hates. Everybody loves to bag on that lens because it's big and it's noisy and it's slow focusing, but it is such a cool rendering of color through it. It's kind of like a soft olive-ish type of, I mean, it just looks like it, you know, it looks like it does. It has a look. Whereas a lot of the other Sony lenses, they try to make them devoid of any kind of look. And since they're all different lenses, that all ends up being a different look. Anyway, I digress. But that's true with the EF lenses too. You know, the older Canon EF lens, they all have a look too. You know, it's just they have that Canon family look, kind of a little bit softer, a little bit warmer, a little bit bloomier. The RF ones aren't like that. The EF ones are like that. The RF ones are still warm. They're still sharp but soft is what I call it, and they're not bloomy like the EF ones are. So, but they all have a look, man. You know, and I like that about them. Hopefully, wobble issue gets reduced with new R1 and R5 Mark II. That's actually why. That's a big reason why I chose the R5C over the R5, over the OG-R5, because I don't, especially with stabilized lenses, I don't typically rely on IBIS for really anything. So if I'm shooting real estate, the 15 to 35 is kind of my workhorse lens. It's image stabilized. The R5 variant cameras, the R5 and the R5C, are so good at high ISO, especially for the 45 megapixel sensor, that, you know, if I'm doing detail shots and things like that, even with the pin sensor, I can still do handheld, like at really pretty slow shutter speeds. But they don't have to be slow because I can crank up the ISO like 1,000, 1,600. Like, ain't nobody gonna know. You know, especially if you're shooting at really shallow depth of field too, it just looks like grain. You know, that's one of the things that I like about the Canon sensors over the Sony sensors is not only that they are a bit cleaner at high ISO than the Sony sensors are, but that the noise pattern looks more like a grain. Whereas the Sony have kind of big chroma blotches and stuff like that noise. But it's kind of uglier, you know, the Sony noise is. So, yeah, I am going to probably call it. It's nice hanging out with you, Mike. You know, I can see that there are many people watching, but nobody's commenting except you, Mike. But I like that. I like chilling with you. I can't think if there's anything else that I wanted to talk to. Gosh, there's been a lot of stuff that's been just released lately, right? There's, what else? So we've talked about the Canon lens, talked a little bit about the R1 coming up. Oh, the first thing that you said was the A9 III. You know, it's funny, man. I keep telling people too, I'm like, I'll believe it when it happens. I mean, does it exist? Do we know that it exists yet? I don't know if we know that it exists yet. You know, it's like there's rumors, but like, does anybody have one? You know, are they shooting on it right now? Yeah, A9 soon. I don't know, because it's like, it's kind of, okay, so this is kind of what I think about that. It's kind of like how, what's Canon going to do with the R5 Mark II to not run it into R3 capability or R5C capability? You know, and so that's kind of how tight it's getting. And the same thing's happening with Sony. Like, what are you going to do with the A9 Mark III to position it under what you say is your flagship, the A1? And right now the A1 is unquestionably the flagship on the planet from any manufacturer, right? But in true Sony fashion, you know they're going to throw everything into the A9 III. You know, they're going to give it all the stuff that the A1 doesn't have that everybody's pissing and moaning about. It's going to get the cool Gumby screen. It might not get the Gumby screen, actually, because it's like a sports thing, and those guys don't want a Gumby screen. But I would think they might save that for the A1 Mark II. But it could get the Gumby screen. It's going to get a much better EVF. It's going to get that 9 point whatever million dot EVF. And the A1 still does have the best implementation of that as well, because even though the A7R5 and the A7S3 have the resolution, they don't have the refresh rate that the A1 does. I mean, the A1 is one of those cameras where, like, when you start looking into the nitty-gritty of all the little specs, it throttles everything else out there from anybody, you know? And so, like I said, that's, you know, the A1 is Canon's biggest problem with designing the R1 is it's really so much above. The A1 is currently so much above really everything else out there that, you know, and it's like, what, a 2.5-year-old camera now. And when Sony gets around to, you know, throwing everything in the kitchen sink into the redesign of that, you know, they are clearly on top right now with the A1. So does that leave room for an A9 Mark III? And how do you price it? Because the A7R5, which is a strange camera, because it has, you know, it seems kind of like what the R5C is. How the R5C is kind of a skunk works kind of camera, where it's like, okay, we have a really successful camera in the R5, but everybody knows about the heat thing, you know. So I mean, we're going to give the thing a fan. And then what can we do to further differentiate? Oh, I know. We'll call it a cinema camera. You know, we'll boot it and make the battery life suck and all this other stuff, you know, just like a cinema camera. And they ended up with like this super powerful, I mean, the ceiling of capability on the R5C is ridiculous, right? But it's so maddening at the same time. And in fairness, it's a much better camera now than it ever has been after a few very good firmware updates. You know, it's a way better camera than it was when it came out, the R5C is. And the R5 too, the OG R5, you know, doesn't overheat anymore. But, you know, what is Sony going to do? What I was saying about that is the A7R5 is like that too, right? It's got all this latest, greatest stuff. It's got the Gumby screen. The Gumby screen is awesome. You know, I had one for a few weeks and was able to work with it and stuff. And it's really like, it's game changing. So they're not the first one. Sony isn't to implement a screen kind of like that, like the S1H has it, and there's some others too. But it so far is the best implementation, and it's not even close. I mean, they've made it thin and rigid and with no like exposed ribbon cables and stuff like that, you know, because I know that's something that a lot of the chatter was like, oh, it's going to break a ribbon cable because it doesn't. It's not. Like they made the device, you know, they designed it really well. So the A7R5 has that. It has the AI focusing thing, which a lot of people can't tell the difference between that and like the A1. You know, it's like maybe that extra horsepower under the hood will translate into something at some point that somebody can tell the difference of between the A7R5 and the A1, but it doesn't look like it's really all that different. And the class leader, the A7 IV, you know, the A7 IV is a fantastic camera. It's a fantastic focusing camera. So, you know, what is Sony going to do with an A9 III to not run it into the A1 or the A7R5? I don't know, because the A7R5's Achilles heel is it's an old sensor. It's an old sensor, and it was never really that great of a sensor anyway. That 61 megapixel sensor in it. So I actually liked the A7R3 more than I did the A7R4 or the A7R5. I just thought it was a more balanced camera, all things considered. So anyway, Mike Ransom and the 5 or 6 other people that are watching right now, it was cool hanging out with you for the past 50 minutes or so. Leave your questions and comments down below, and we'll get to them. Let me, before I jet here, let me see if there's any others that I should... Oh yeah, Real Steel. He did a big old one about drones. We should do we should do one of these live streams just about drones, because we probably could. I can pull out my Inspire 2 that I crashed a long time ago unsuccessfully repaired. Well, I had it repaired and it was unsuccessful. But right about then, the Air 2S had come out, and I kind of just, I got the Air 2S just because I needed something right then. And it was such a better drone than the Inspire 2, even though the Inspire 2 has, has a big giant. I've got the X7, I think it is, which is like the APS-C camera on it. And I've just never dealt with it. It's still just like kind of half broken in a case. So maybe I'll pull that out and we'll, I don't know, lob watermelons at it or something. So, all right. Well, thank you guys for joining. Rob Phoenix, how you doing, bud? All right. And thank you for joining, and I'll see you